Hi, this is Dr. Erica Lewis, and this lecture is on observation for design. Those of you who are experienced health providers have a lot of observation experience. It's part of your assessment. Those of you who are beginning learners, sometimes you may have heard other health providers say that they know more just walking in the door and talking to a patient for 10 seconds than the whole formal assessment process can tell them. And sometimes health providers will describe this as intuition, that they just have an intuitive sense of how the person is doing. And I'm really interested in that concept of intuition and have done quite a bit of reading on it within nursing and outside of it. And what I'm seeing consistently in the literature is that intuition may actually be the way that people describe observations that they make, observations based on experiences that are so ingrained that they happen so quickly. The processing of those observations happens so quickly, in fact, more quickly than the cognitive part of our brain function. So it's just so quick that you're not even realize you're thinking it. And they do have some MRI studies that are showing that. So when people say, they had an intuition or they just kind of knew, it's interesting to ask them to parse that out a little bit. And many times you'll get a story that is, a little bit more in depth than the way they initially viewed it. So, for example, I was talking to a nurse about knowing that a code was going to happen. And she just said she walked in the room and just knew, that this was pending. And ultimately, she turned out, to be making a good call. That patient was unstable. And, she was pretty insistent. No, I just knew. That was going to happen. It was a sense. And upon prompting, she could realize that the skin color was off, the belly was a little bit more enlarged than normally, and she had this mental picture of what a healthy person looks like and what a person who codes is going to look like based on her experiences from the past, and was able to know that that patient was in a difficult clinical situation without even being able to articulate specifically what it was that made her know that. So just know that, think about that intuition thing and observation as it relates to your clinical practice. But the purpose of this particular lecture is to think about design and what observation can bring to our design, because we are ultimately doing this problem curation to consider designing new solutions for really important crisis in our in our country and related to our professions. So if you just look at this slide here, I've prompted some things through design on this slide. So based on graphic design methodology, it's unlikely that many of you read the photo credit information in the lower right-hand corner of this slide in great detail. So your eyes may have looked at it, but it's likely that you didn't read it in full, and very unlikely that you read it first. The word design likely stood out to you, and there's a whole world of marketing capitalizing on this science of observation. So we can draw some knowledge from those fields and use observations to benefit our professions, and both from a design perspective and even in our clinical settings. So it's a really brief, quick lecture, and it's just meant to introduce you for our first time to what observation looks like from a design perspective. So here you see the contents of a bag. And these are all still photos that I'm going to show you during our lecture today. We'll say that, observations during even a video, but definitely an in-person interaction, you're going to see a lot more depth of what you can observe in those situations. So don't write this off, because it feels a little contrived to look at a still photo in a lecture. That's honestly gonna feel contrived. Go with a process here so that you can get an idea of how of what we're talking about, just to understand it, and then give it a whirl in your interviews coming up, or in your daily life, trying out these ideas for observation. So just take a look at this and take a minute and write down on a piece of paper some of the things you observe about this. So if you think of it using the empathy map framework, you write some of your observations, and then consider some inferences too, like what might it mean what you're seeing. I'm going to give you a minute, and actually go ahead and just hit pause on the lecture, and then when you have a few things written, maybe 3, maybe 5, go ahead and resume the lecture. So this is where a conversation in an in-person class is really fun. I wish I could hear from you each of what the things you said, and I learned something about observation each time I do this lecture and show this photo to a class. So what might this picture of the contents of a person's bag, what do you notice about that, and what might it mean? So as an expert observer, I notice certain things, and those are similar things to what some students have mentioned in the past. So one student, the first time I showed this picture to a class, said that they noticed that this person likely cares about self-care, because what they see are things like chapstick, eye drops, sunglasses. They also mentioned that this person may not have a lot of time for self-care. It's a little haphazard given the cords are all a mess, and that things are just kind of seem a bit thrown together. So there are some of the assumptions they would make about this is a person who cares about self-care and is pretty busy and has a hard time maybe getting self-care in. So that would be an interesting observation to test with the group, or test with this person. Another person looked at this and said something kind of similar, but at the end said, well, I really think this is a male, because it looks like there was a sticker on the computer, and maybe that was just like ripped off or something, and I feel like the cords aren't done up, and to me that represents more male characteristics. So interestingly, this is my bag and my junk from a couple years ago, this photo, and it's always interesting to hear what people say about that and the assumptions they make, and it's a good reminder for me to tell students, like, you can get at a lot through some observations. That overall idea that this person cares about self-care but doesn't have a ton of time, so is doing it in a hurry, is kind of spot on. And just glancing at the contents of the bag, someone can learn kind of a relatively deep and important thing about me. The assumption that this is a person who identifies as male, is not true. And so that's also a good reminder that these observations, they can get at the most important things from an interview and about a person. These are the latent needs, the things that people aren't going to tell you. I couldn't have sat down in an interview with that person and just in talking about my bag and have said, yeah, I really value self-care, and I just don't have time for it. If we were just talking about the contents of my bag, I wouldn't have gotten to that. But they could observe that just by looking and making some inferences. At the same time, I don't identify as male, so that was incorrect, that other observation. So you can make some of the best inferences through these observations, at the same time, you really do have to validate those to make sure they make sense with the end user. So if that person had said to me in the course of an interview, gosh, I see your things and I'm curious about, what that means about self-care and your life, I would have been a way to validate that assumption. And if they had said something along the lines of, I think these things might belong to a guy, a person who identifies as male, what do you think about that? Both times it would have given the end user an opportunity to validate that inference being made, and that validation is incredibly important. Now, in your work, in design, and now in your work, you won't always be able to validate with the exact specific end user you first talk to. So let's say you talk to a health provider about needs related to substance use disorder, and you make some inferences from that. And there's really no way for you to go back and talk to that exact same health provider. Well, think about the population you're designing for, or you're thinking about the context of this problem from, and asking other members of that group is acceptable. But you always do want to do that ask so that you're validating the assumptions you're making. So these are some recommendations from IDEO, a famous design firm, and I'll let you read through those. This is what they encourage you to look at when you're observing things that can help you create new spaces for design. So looking at a situation for things that prompt behavior, looking for adaptations. So is everyone experiencing a problem and one person has found a way to adapt and work around that problem? Well, how they work around that problem may be a solution space for you, or maybe may illustrate a problem that other people are having and not mentioning. You can often tell what people care about by observing their behavior and observing a situation. Their body language and voice can say more than actual words. In a recent report, it was argued that only 7% of what we say is our word, the words we choose, and the rest is body language and voice inflection, which is a pretty big percentage, that isn't being explicitly articulated. So if you learn to pay attention to that other 93%, you can learn a lot more about what someone's saying in an interview, or by watching what they're doing. And I will say I find that health providers and even health profession students, so I have some students in my design classes that are pre-professional, like they haven't started their nursing program, but they're planning to be a nurse. And I find that they are really good at this observation of body language and voice in general, as a general rule. So it's interesting, I think perhaps people who value this are drawn to the health professions. I find that when I teach, pre-nursing students and engineering students, it's often that pre-nursing student who is making these observations and inferences well about body language and voice in their interviews. Looking for patterns and themes. So by looking for the patterns, you can see the areas that you can have a big impact in design, or a space that really needs a lot of design or change. And then kind of conversely, the opposite of that, looking for what's unexpected and out of place, maybe an outlier, because there's also space for innovation, for thinking about the problem differently, and hence a unique design in that opposite, in the outlier of the unexpected out of place thing. All right, so let's look at some photos and get some practice getting into the mindset of a designer. Remember, again, it's going to be a little less dynamic than when you're doing it in an interview or a video, a little bit more contrived, but just stick with me, give it a whirl so you can practice these skills a little bit and get ready to think about observation from the perspective of a designer. All right, go ahead and again pause this, and using these ideas that you've just heard about, write down some observations that you make about this image. Again, I'm just super curious about what you wrote with your pause there during the pause time. And to mention a few things that students have observed in the past, just to give you some comparisons. Things that prompt behavior. So some students have observed that this person seems to be wearing a backpack, and they wonder if there's a scheduled school thing if this person's walking to school. They seem to be walking along that line on the edge of the road, and so there's something about the design of that is prompting them to walk in that specific place, perhaps. Adaptations, students have mentioned that there's lots of things hanging off of this backpack, and if they could interview this person, they might ask, like, what is that about? What is that, what challenge is that solving in this person's life? What this person cares about. So students have mentioned that this person is walking in the rain. So perhaps they really value walking, and that's something that they might want, might be interested in asking about. They also have, some reflective stuff on them. And so people are curious, maybe they really are a person that cares about safety. And then, kind of thinking about the tension of some of that. Others have mentioned, well, they're also getting their pants all wet. So they seem conscientious. They've got this umbrella, but they've got wet pants and wet shoes, and there's some tension there between what they care about. So it might be worth finding out about that and learning more. I don't know if you made any body language or voice observations here. That tends to be one that students observe less in this picture. They do seem to be walking somewhat steadily up what appears to be a big hill. So students have commented on that. Any patterns or themes that you saw here? And nothing usually comes up about that, but perhaps you've observed something. And then unexpected and out of place. Many times students do mention that, the wet kind of shoes and feet versus the safety conscious kind of thing that, interested them. So, we don't know if those observations are right, and those would be the type of things we would observe in a situation that would prompt us to ask more about this person and their behavior, and learn about them, make observations, and be able to interview them better based on the observations. So I'll tell you, this is my kiddo walking to school, again, a couple years ago. And many of the observations that people made were, correct about her. Super conscientious. There were some workarounds going on with the adaptations as far as the things put on the backpack. And so it is interesting, again, to me, that people can make observations that can really get to important things about people just based on a random shot that doesn't even, photo shot that doesn't even show their face. All right, again, pause and write down some things you're observing. All right, so what are some of the things that I notice about this image? And you may notice really different things. There's no one right answer. These are observations used to deepen your knowledge of a situation and to give you inferences to test out with your interviews and with your ideas to test. Maybe you like to think of it like a hypothesis. So some of our scientifically minded students in our design classes like to think of, when I'm observing, I'm making hypotheses to see, and then I have to test those out to see if they're correct and when I validate them. What do I notice about this? So I might ask, consider that these people value, an intimate setting. I see that the table is small. I see that they've positioned, their table kind of intimately next to that tall hedge and under the tree in a nice cozy fashion. So to me, I'd be interested in, do these people care about an intimate setting for forming their friend relationships? I noticed that there's a hose going back towards what appears to be a grill. So I might infer that these people are conscientious of safety and ask about that. Things that prompt behavior, well, there's some food sitting in front of people and they're eating it. So from a very basic observation, the presence of food prompting the eating. Do I see any adaptations? It's a little hard to see, but I'm really curious about that kind of graded looking thing hanging in the background. Like, why is that there? It looks a little, out of place, and I'm just kind of curious, does it serve a purpose or solve a problem? The body language, to me, these people seem to be, kind of enjoying a time together and curious about who's taking the photo. My guess is that they know the person taking the photo in the way they're kind of glancing over at them. And then I did think, unexpected or out of place. I noticed that there's wine glasses, but no wine, which seemed a little awkward because people are eating. So that made me wonder, maybe this photo is actually staged. So that made me curious. All right, so moving on to our next one. Go ahead and hit pause again and write down several observations about this image. Now that you've unpaused, I'm curious what you said. Just in looking at this, some of the things that stood out to me as unexpected or out of place. This seems like a pretty pristine environment. Yet, these pretzels are just kind of laying there, next to the person's foot, not on a plate. So that, seemed a little bit out of place with the other sense of the atmosphere. The body language, this person seems pretty relaxed. You might be curious about what they're doing on the computer. Are they working? They're obviously making some adaptations. They've got that blanket that's keeping them warm. What challenge is that solving for them? They're sitting, maybe at a less traditional spot for being on a computer. So, not at a desk. So what does that represent? Are there any things that prompt behavior here? So having that table close to the sofa, if it wasn't there, the person couldn't put their foot up. What challenge is that solving? If it wasn't there, they couldn't have their food and drink on it. Again, solving a challenge for them. And what do they care about? Can make some inferences about, them caring about aesthetics and comfort at the same time that might be interesting to ask about. So all of those, just, some basic observations about this space and this person and what they're doing that we would want to ask about in an interview. All right, so just take a minute, read through these 6 things again, and take these with you as you go into your interviews and about your life for ways that you can think about observation from a design perspective in a new way.